Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Saturday everybody. I hope you're enjoying your weekend. It is the weekend, so I'll try to keep it as light as possible. And as we usually do on weekend videos, we tend to look deeper into foreign affairs and ideology, and today's video will be no exception, very much focused on these themes. We begin with Europe-China updates. The two blocs move closer to a full-blown trade war, with China's Ministry of Commerce in an incredible statement saying in a Thursday announcement, quote, "So far China has shown the utmost sincerity and flexibility, and both sides have made significant progress in some areas. However, due to the EU's persistent lack of active response to core concerns of the China-EU industry, significant differences remain in the consultations." End quote. In the same Thursday press event, a spokesperson confirmed that the Ministry of Commerce is studying measures related to raising tariffs on imports of large engine fuel-powered cars, and, quote, "will make a decision after considering relevant factors." End quote. He added that there are significant disagreements between China and the EU on the latter's decision to move ahead with tariffs on Chinese EVs. China has invited EU officials to visit China for further negotiations, essentially threatening the EU with tariffs unless they roll back the recent EV tariffs. Interestingly, China's mooted tariffs would hurt German industry the most, even though Germany voted against the EU trade barriers. Meanwhile, according to trade data published this week, EU exports to China declined 11% year-on-year in August, reflecting the economic drop-off in China. Geopolitical concerns, recently worsened by heightened tensions in the Middle East, continue to weigh down too. Moving to the UK now, this week UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy made a visit to Beijing, the first visit to China by a UK cabinet minister under the new Labour government. Lammy arrived in Beijing yesterday, Friday, and today, Saturday, he is in Shanghai. While Beijing used regular diplomatic language to describe the visit, Chinese academics and other commentators were a bit more blunt in their analysis of the visit. Wang Yiwei, a professor of international relations at Renmin University in Beijing, for example, said Britain's, quote, "domestic financial situation was fueling efforts to re-engage," end quote. Indeed, UK media reports have said that former Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen, who had been invited to visit the country this month by a parliamentary group, had been asked to postpone the trip because the government wanted to avoid upsetting Beijing ahead of Lammy's visit. Wang explained that, quote, "the decision is a sincere gesture shown by the Labour government and clearly shows the UK's strong desire to improve its relationship with Beijing," end quote. And it wasn't just this gesture either. UK-based The Guardian writes that, quote, "Labour has backtracked on plans to push for formal recognition of China's treatment of the Uyghurs as genocide in the run-up to David Lammy's trip to the country this weekend," end quote. The outlet writes that the trip marks a shift in the British government's approach to China, with ministers seeking to improve engagement and build closer economic ties. Trade between the UK and China is worth £110 billion a year, $143 billion US. These moves are a far cry from Labour's position in opposition. As Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lammy told US outlet Politico last March that Labour would pursue legal routes towards declaring China's crackdown on Uyghur Muslims a genocide by acting, quote, "multilaterally with our partners," end quote, through international courts. While likely to be deeply unpopular domestically in the UK, this 180 from Labour was received warmly, rhetorically at least, in Beijing. In his meeting with Lammy in Beijing yesterday, PRC Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that China has agreed to fully restart dialogue and cooperation with the UK. Wang expressed China's commitment to working with Britain across various sectors such as trade, finance, green development, technology, healthcare and education. However, he emphasized the importance of mutual respect and equality in these discussions, highlighting the need for a positive environment for cooperation. Wang also reiterated China's stance on non-interference in its internal affairs, specifically mentioning Hong Kong and Taiwan. Lammy also met with Chinese Vice Premier Ding Xuexiang, who stated that the interests of the two countries are deeply connected. Lammy echoed the sentiment, stating that the new British government is committed to constructive dialogue and joint efforts to address global challenges. While the public statements were positive, Privately, the two sides have deep differences on topics such as democratic values, human rights, Hong Kong and Ukraine. Indeed, according to an official readout, Britain's Foreign Secretary urged China to investigate claims its companies supplied weapons to Russian forces in Ukraine after the United States slapped sanctions on a host of Chinese companies. Lammy told Foreign Minister Wang Yi that the UK and China had a, quote, shared interest in European peace and ending the war, end quote, in Ukraine. He argued that Chinese supply of equipment to Russia, quote, risks damaging China's relations with Europe whilst helping to sustain Russia's war, end quote. China's own readout, by contrast, says only that the pair, quote, exchanged views on international and regional matters such as the Ukraine crisis, end quote. Lammy is scheduled to meet British business leaders in Shanghai today. Next up, Jude Blanchette, Chair in China Studies at the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, has published a review of two recent books about Xi Jinping this week. The two books, both worth reading, are Steve Tsang and Olivia Chung's The Political Thought of Xi Jinping, and Kevin Rudd's on Xi Jinping, How Xi's Marxist Nationalism is Shaping China and the World. Rudd's book was published on Friday. The book review piece is called Is Xi Jinping a Marxist? Xi Jinping Thought Articulated in Texts by China's Leader and Dissected by Two New Books has the power to reshape China for decades to come. So what exactly does Xi Jinping think? This is such an interesting article, especially if you're a nerd for this kind of thing like I am, and I would highly recommend reading the entire article if you are too. Now we're going to end today's video by examining the piece, but just quickly, if you get some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Sharing and subscribing is also a big help. Only about 41% of regular viewers are subscribed. It'd be awesome if we could get this below 40%. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description below for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. Okay, we now quote selected excerpts from the Blanchette piece directly. It is a paradox that Xi Jinping remains an enigma, given that for the past 12 years he has been leader of the world's largest military, second largest nation by population size, second largest economy, and second largest political party. Xi's interactions with foreign leaders and other outsiders are highly scripted, leaving next to no space for spontaneous interactions. Little is known about his personal habits and interests. The circle he trusts for counsel is small and shrinking. In public appearances, he is controlled, measured, enigmatic. China's and Xi's isolation during its draconian COVID lockdowns only exacerbated this trend toward impenetrability. But if we don't know much about Xi the man, the same cannot be said about what Xi thinks. Here, his output has been prodigious, assembled and presented to the world beginning in 2017 as Xi Jinping Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for a New Era. Synthesizing Xi Jinping's voluminous thought is the subject of two recent books, both published by Oxford University Press. The Political Thought of Xi Jinping, January 2024, provides a balanced, brisk overview of Xi's ideas about governance, politics and society. Ambassador Kevin Rudd's On Xi Jinping, How Xi's Marxist Nationalism is Shaping China and the World, October 2024, is more ambitious, seeking a macro thesis explaining Xi's overall political ideological project that centers Marxism, not just Leninism, in driving Xi's agenda and worldview. One of the first books to treat Xi's ideas seriously, as opposed to the many other titles that explore his family story, his tenure as General Secretary, and his foreign and domestic policy, The Political Thought of Xi Jinping applied three concentric circles of sources to understand his underlying ideology: Xi's oral and written remarks, the macro policy plans that have been promulgated on his watch, and an analysis of how Xi's vision has been implemented or not. Tsang and Chung, both academics at SOAS, University of London, succeed in their concise distillation of Xi's major political and policy priorities, including both his aspirations and his paranoia. While the authors harbour clearly articulated concerns about China's grand strategy under Xi, the text is more analytical than alarmist. Clinical in their language, they steer the reader through a crisp 210 pages that build a foundational understanding of Xi's expansive policy and political agenda since he came to power in late 2012. According to Tsang and Chung, Xi Jinping thought is a body of evolving ideological and governance concepts that, unlike Mao Zedong thought, is not wedded to Marxist principles of permanent revolution, but instead focuses on reinvigorating the Leninist trendles that keep the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, in power domestically, and channeling China's formidable resources to establish China as a comprehensive global superpower. While the authors see Xi thought as deeply ideological, it is an ideology tied not to communism, but to serving the CCP. In On Xi Jinping, Kevin Rudd has written the most comprehensive analysis of Xi to date, one that will set the bar for future studies of Xi's governing philosophy. Rudd is also likely the only author of a study on Xi to have spent time alone with his subjects, as he did when Xi visited Canberra in 2010, when Rudd was serving as Prime Minister. This singular work, which emerged from Rudd's doctoral thesis at Oxford, brings with it a tactile ability to view Xi through multiple lenses: politician, bureaucrat, coalition builder, grand strategist. The book draws on an extraordinary range of primary sources in Chinese, secondary sources, and academic literature. The footnotes and bibliography alone are over 170 pages to build a comprehensive composite of Xi's worldview, the sources that inspire it, and how he is channeling that to transform China. There is very little by way of personal biography, unlike other titles on Xi. It is rather a study in ideas, ideology, and governing philosophy. Rudd argues that Xi is profoundly different from his immediate predecessors in three important respects. First, Xi has moved domestic politics towards what Rudd calls the Leninist left, which entails a dramatic centralization of decision-making, a disciplinary rectification of the party, and the reinvigoration of orthodox ideology throughout the policy-making and governance apparatus. Second, economic policy under Xi has shifted to the Marxist left, with a de-emphasis on the growth-at-all-costs model that defined much of the reform and opening era, a high tolerance for state intervention in the economy, and a shift in spending priorities toward technologies that will power the Chinese economy for decades to come. Third, foreign policy under Xi has become more confrontational and assertive, in a move toward the nationalist right that strives to center Chinese power in its regional relationships, to alter global institutions to better serve Chinese interests, and to create advantageous terms in its bilateral relationship with the United States. Taken as a whole, Rudd sees China's transformations as coalescing into a new ideological governance framework that he calls Marxist-Leninist nationalism, or Marxist nationalism for short. In contrast to Tsang and Chung, Rudd does not view Xi's national project as primarily focusing on ensuring the party's grip on power, although he argues that this certainly matters to Xi. Nor does he see Xi's adherence to Marxism as shallow or ideological theatre. Xi, Rudd argues, is a real, bona fide Marxist, not just in his adoption of its analytical techniques, but also in how he sees the substance and direction of policy and governance more broadly. Xi's Marxist-Leninist nationalism, he argues, is, quote, not just cynically seen as a convenient ideological fiction to hold the party together and to define its enemies both within and without, end quote. Instead, he sees a, quote, fundamental commitment to Marxism-Leninism, end quote, with dialectical materialism being the, quote, intellectual engine room, end quote, of Xi's Marxist worldview. Rudd argues that Xi's ideological convictions are genuine and foundational, driving his efforts to assert party control, reshape the international order, and secure China's future as a socialist superpower. What would Marx make of contemporary China under Xi? It is difficult to speculate, but there is much he would likely not approve of. Although wealth distribution in China has long been highly unequal, citizens tolerated these disparities because they believed that their personal efforts could lift them from poverty to relative prosperity. Yet a recent Stanford University research paper shows that for the first time in 20 years, most Chinese respondents believe wealth is shaped by structural inequalities rather than individual merit. There has been no widespread tax reform, which is essential if China is going to adequately provide for the medical and social services needed to support the coming wave of retirees exiting the workforce. Despite some recent progress, educational opportunities and outcomes vary widely by income and geography. China's healthcare system remains underfunded and ruthlessly capitalistic. Indeed, after more than a decade in power, Xi has failed to implement any significant policies that have fundamentally and genuinely moved China closer to a type of socialism that makes breakthroughs in enriching the people, not just the state. By way of comparison, areas that Xi Jinping clearly sees as priorities, such as national security, have witnessed a wholesale transformation as Xi applies his significant political capital to drive reform in the face of stiff opposition. A real Marxist would take the resources and energy that have been ploughed into Xi's anti-corruption campaign, his military modernization, and his overall national security outlook, and instead channel them into fiscal, educational, and healthcare reform. Any plausible argument for prioritizing socialism evaporates when the field of analysis is Xinjiang or Tibet. She understands that Leninism provides a potent ideological framework for autocrats due to its inherent emphasis on centralized control, the suppression of political opposition, and the elevation of the party as the sole legitimate representative of the people and their collective will. His methods, which blend Leninist control with modern economic, technological, and military prowess, represent a more aggressive and concentrated effort to reclaim China's historical stature, the long-term goal of challenging the current global power balance. That is the goal, yet it is becoming more evident by the day that to achieve this objective, Xi is corrupting the machinery of effective governance, like Stalin and Mao did before him. He has replaced pragmatism with paranoia, merit with loyalty, and debate with blind obedience. Governing institutions that once seemed to be serving the nation as a whole now serve one man's unrelenting pursuit of power for the party that he leads. Bureaucratic professionalism is giving way to fear-driven stagnation, as officials scramble to stay in favor, not to solve governance challenges. The promise of a prosperous, harmonious society has been bartered for the promise of stability, security, and national greatness. Yet the price of pursuing these goals, paid in the currency of repression, continues to rise. The question is not just whether Xi will achieve his aims, but what will be left of China if he does. Here ends the direct quote of the piece and today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, have a great and restful weekend, and I will see you all again for a new week of updates on Monday.